Within this week, we will be exploring a little bit of um, the evolution of services for exceptional students, as well as some approaches to curriculum for exceptional students. If you recall, last week we started off discussing exceptionality by talking about gifted students. And that's one form of exceptionality. But the other side of that coin is students with learning disabilities. And they too have exceptional needs that need to be addressed within education. And it's not unheard of for someone to be twice exceptional or to be called 2E, and where they have exceptional giftings in one area, but areas of struggle in other areas. And so we need to be mindful of all of these students and their needs. So, just taking a little bit of time to talk about the evolution of services and describe a little bit of the diversity within that public schools demonstrate in dealing with exceptional abilities. As early as the 1960s, persons with exceptionalities were educated separately from their typically achieving peers. And in the United States, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, also known as IDEA for Individuals Disabilities Education Act, guarantees that children with exceptionalities are educated with their peers without exceptionalities. And Canada's movement toward that idea of inclusion was a little bit slower than the United States. And each of the provinces, because provinces and territories manage their own education, instituted this principle of inclusion at their varying rates. But in 1982, there was an adoption of the Constitution Act made in Canada. It was the first country in the world to have constitutionally guaranteed rights for those with exceptionalities. And all provinces and all territories from that point forward certainly made moves towards inclusion of students with special needs. But still, territories will adhere to the ideal of inclusion and incorporating an inclusive model to varying degrees and in different ways. But before the 1970s, individuals with exceptionalities were generally provided with separate special services. And these students would rarely interact with their typically achieving peers. And these programs were small and very few were served by them. For example, children with sensory deficits or intellectual disabilities were often placed in residential programs. And these programs offered daily living support as well as education. But since the 1970s, schools have provided services that are more appropriate and more what we consider to be an inclusive model for education. Service for students with exceptionalities really have evolved into through three distinct phases, where there was a relative isolation and a move towards integration or mainstreaming, and then finally full inclusion within the classroom. So today's teachers really need to be prepared to meet the diverse needs of all students because of this principle of inclusive classrooms. Now, let's talk a little bit about students with special needs. So it's really estimated that about 10% of school-age children in Canada have a recognized exceptionality. And so it's really a given that you're going to be dealing with students with exceptionalities on a daily basis. And then there's another group of students that are considered to be at risk for developing learning or behavioral problems. And so there's lots of diversity among students in the public schools. And that really is normal rather than the exception. So it's normal to have students with exceptional needs. And so when we think in terms of exceptional and students with exceptionalities, the term exceptional really describes individuals with diverse needs who differ from their typical achieving peers in some manner. And so that exceptionality really includes the range, as I already mentioned, of people with gifts and talents that are exceptional to people experiencing significant deficits in a variety of areas. And although the term exceptionality is used to describe individuals' areas of need, it also allows for the discussion of an individual's abilities. And so it's often useful to use the term exceptionality rather than disability, because disability is so much more restrictive. It can be defined as an inability to do something, a diminished capacity to perform in a specific way. The term disability is frequently used when referring to a specific category of exceptionalities, like, for example, a learning disability, that sort of thing. And students with exceptionalities are defined differently in different provinces and different territories. But what we will be looking at in this course will be, as already became clear, students with special giftings, as well as students with various types of impairments or disabilities. So people with intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities or emotional or behavioral problems or auditory or visual impairments or orthopedic impairments or autism or some type of traumatic brain injury or a developmental disorder related to, say, something like fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or language or speech disorders. And, of course, those students classified as gifted or talented as well. So there's a lot that we will be covering within this. Now, when students are trying to obtain services, so students with special needs, the majority of students who receive special services are first identified by the classroom teacher. And typically a school team becomes involved. So it's important to work with your colleagues to help identify the special needs that a student might have. And that part of that process is initiating an assessment process. And when I mean assessment, I'm really meaning the process of gathering information on a particular student to determine the eligibility for special services and what strengths in areas of need for programming purposes are required. And then there can be later assessments to measure the success of whatever interventions are being put in place. And so there's lots of different types of assessments, and you'll be able to look at some of those within the textbook. But when we think of it, school-based assessments, teachers really are the consumers of assessment information. They are producing the assessment information. They're communicating the assessment information, and they're developing even some of the assessment tools. So the process of assessment is really first off to do some initial screening and as well as determining the eligibility for some special education services that may be required. There are formal assessment instruments that can be used. We won't go into that in too much detail because that's a little bit of a more specialized area when you would get into psychometric testing and that sort of thing. But there's also informal tests and measures that are really tied fairly closely with the everyday work of teachers and the formal assessments that they have. But there's also criterion reference testing, where you're comparing the performance of a student on a given task with normed reference information about their peers and what you would expect at different ages. But you always need to keep in mind, and I did mention this last week, that there can be bias on assessments. And so it's always important that with normed reference standardized tests particularly, there may be some inherent discriminatory bias in there as far as culture or linguistic background that may disadvantage a certain group. So you need to be mindful of all the norming that was done with the test. So it's important to be very knowledgeable about the development of the tests that you will be using, as well as the clients that you will be dealing with. Now, what are some things that we can do when we have a exceptional student? One of the things that we can do is to tailor the education to the needs of the student. And in doing that, normally a team will get together and develop that, being led largely by the classroom teacher because they're the one that will need to be implementing this. And that really is what we call the individualized education programs. So an individualized education program really it's referred to by a different number of different names. Sometimes in BC we call it the individual program plan, the IPP, or the individual education plan, the IEP. Whatever we're doing with the individualized education program, we're really setting out what are the exceptionalities of this student. How can we help them to meet their educational needs? And as I mentioned, a team really goes through and helps to develop this. So this team needs to be the stakeholders. So obviously the teacher is going to be part of this. The student is going to be part of this. The parents or guardians, when appropriate, should be part of this, and as well as a school administrator or some specialist that can help with assessment or with some special area of knowledge that where the person can help the student in some way. And the individualized education program is developed by this group of individuals with the participation of the parents, helping them to buy in and helping the students to buy in. And this will give direction to what kinds of instructional support the student might need. What are the basis for the evaluation? So what are the goals that should be met, and how do we judge the progress of the student and judge whether or not the teaching with this new instructional direction is effective? And then communication. How can we communicate among the team members to keep everybody buying into this plan? So all of these things are part of it, and there should always be within an individual education program short-term objectives or benchmarks. So you want an annual goal that reflects the logical sequence of steps for the education plan that try to keep in line with the general education plan of the peers. But at the same time, you want to have some short-term objectives and benchmarks to see where the student is along this line. And there are lots of different things that fall upon the teachers. Obviously, the teacher needs to be able to work with the team, needs to be able to develop all of these plans to be implemented by the student. And in the midst of all of this, there is some exciting opportunities that can take place. So I'd now like to take a little bit of time and talk a little bit about the different types of ways of doing inclusion for dealing with exceptionality. But as I do, I just want to kind of clarify a little bit of the terminology that we'll be using around exceptionality, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we think about placement, that really refers to the physical environment in which a student is being educated, while the term program will be used to refer to the child's educational program. Accommodation, that refers to the specialized support and services that are provided to enable students with diverse needs to achieve learning exceptions. And this may include technological equipment. It may include support staff and maybe even some informal supports. Then adaptation, and that refers to adjustments to the curriculum content or usual instructional practices or materials or technology, assessment strategies, and the learning environment made in accordance with the strengths, needs, and interests of the learner. And interests here, I just want to do a bit of a side note here. Interests are important, and teachers need to be mindful of that, because that is where strengths for learning can grow. Okay? And then finally, the term modification, and that refers to changes in policy that will support students with exceptionalities in their learning. So, for example, altering the school curriculum in some way, or adjusting the attendance policy in some way. Remember that when we're dealing with exceptionalities, policies need to be a little bit fluid in order to make sure that we're really serving the person rather than the system. Because in the end, it's the service of the student and the educating of the student that is important. So educating students with exceptionalities really involves the setting in which students with exceptionalities should receive educational and related services in order to help them to grow. And that is one of the key aspects of the individualized education program or individual education plan. So when we talk in terms of special education classroom approaches, students with special needs receive the majority of their educational program from a special education teacher in a special education classroom. And this was historically the model that has been used in education from the 1950s through to about the 1970s, 1980s. The general education teachers often liked this model because it meant that they did not have to deal with the students with the special needs. And some of the identified advantages to separate settings for special needs students really include the fact that you get well-trained specialists that provide this type of education. that education is selected from a variety of methods and curriculums, and there's some specialized motivational strategies that often best fit the special needs of students. And there's a system in place to monitor the students' growth and progress. But there's also some criticisms, and that is that this model include that it is not a normal school placement and does not support notions of diversity. Okay, so that's one model that has historically been in place for special education and for dealing with students with exceptionalities. Then there's the resource room model, and some of you may have seen this. The resource room is a special education classroom that special needs students go to only for special instruction. So the special needs student spends part of the day in the general education classroom with his or her non-special needs peers. And one of the identified advantages of the resource room model is that students with exceptionalities are able to interact with their peers of their chronological age. And this can also have a positive impact on the typically achieving student, because there's a greater range of diversity, and diversity breeds strength in education, because you're exposed to different people of different abilities, and you start to understand that is really what normal life is about. But some criticisms of this model is that this kind of pull-out program is very disruptive to the routine of the general education classroom. And then there's the inclusive education program. And there's been a lot of movement for dismantling the so-called dual education system in favor of a more unified education system for all students that is much more inclusive. And so within the inclusion model, it's really come to mean including special needs students in the general education classroom with provisions for special services within the general education classroom when necessary. So inclusion is more than just placement. It's truly giving all an opportunity to participate. And many oppose the inclusion model and recommend the continued use of a continuum of services model, which provides placement and programming options along a continuum of least to most restrictive. And some of the identified advantages of the inclusion model include opportunities for social interaction, ease in accessing the general curriculum, and academic improvements. Now, there's been some studies on inclusion in the United States that have shown teachers and parents really have mixed views, from some general support to no real support, no real opinion on inclusion. And some of the criticisms of the inclusion model include the fact that general educators have not been involved sufficiently, that general educators may not have the knowledge or the skills enabling them to make needed adaptations or accommodations or modifications to a student's program. And in the end, if we're wanting to have evidence-based choices, there's limited evidence, empirical data that can support the inclusive model. The special education teachers work much more closely with the general education teacher in the inclusion model, and in the inclusion model, the classroom teacher has more of an active role in providing services to the special needs students. Now, typically, there are some certain methods for enhancing the inclusion of students with exceptionalities. And Weber has identified 5 critical dimensions for successful inclusive classrooms. The first one is a sense of community and social acceptance. And that really means having a successful inclusive setting that fosters a strong sense of community in which all students are seen as equal. And also, diversity here is valued in that difference is acceptable to teachers and to peers. The teacher's attitude, the expectations, and the competence of the teacher all play critical roles in promoting a sense of community and acceptance. And teachers really need to prepare students to interact with students with special needs by increasing their knowledge, for example, giving accurate information about specific differences and the effects that these differences will have on them, and developing positive peer interactions. So there's a management of relationships that needs to take place as part of the education process, but this can be extremely beneficial for everyone. Secondly, an appreciation of study diversity. Teachers really should be sensitive to the cultural, the community, and family values that can impact on a students' educational experiences. Teachers need to recognize and respond to a student's educational needs and be able to relate sensitively to cultural, community, and family values, and recognize and celebrate different types of diversity in the classroom, whether that be religious diversity, linguistic diversity, diversity in skills, whatever it might be. And there needs to be this acceptance of diversity. Thirdly, an attention to curricular needs. If the individual curricular needs of a student are not being met, the educational placement must be re-examined. So, curricular concerns have two issues. First off, providing content that is meaningful to students in a current and future sense, and developing and implementing approaches and materials that work best for them. So educators can include things like technology into the student's educational program to help them meet their learning strengths and needs. And there's a lot of empirical evidence supporting their use of technology and documenting potential outcomes. Then finally, there is the importance for effective management and instruction. So in the inclusive classrooms, teachers' practices need to be flexible, and they need to have a range that addresses all students' needs. So within that effective management and instruction, there should really be, first off, successful classroom management. And this includes the physical management, clear procedures for the managing of the classroom, instructional management, as well as behavior management. And so you need to keep all of those in mind as you are managing a classroom. And then there should be some effective instructional techniques. So daily reviews, specific techniques for presenting new information, guided practice, giving independent practice, as well as some formative evaluations rather than just summative evaluations. There should also be some appropriate adaptation that takes place, changes in ways that students are taught, ways that you give assignments, ways that you give homework and testing. All of that variability can help with having effective management and instruction. And then finally, some personnel support and collaboration. So some students with special needs require personnel support in order for students to benefit from placement in inclusive settings. And so there should be some professional staff that are involved that include special education teachers as well as paraeducators. People like teacher assistants or educational assistants or teachers' aides, or people that give some kind of related service and support for the student can be very important and an essential part of this whole process. So when we think in terms of maintaining an effective, inclusive classroom, we need to remember that this is a constant case of vigilance and a constant need for reevaluation. Are we on track with the student? Is there something that we can do better? And maintain some flexibility within that. An inflexible person dealing with a diverse, inclusive classroom will have a very difficult time. You need to develop a sense of flexibility, of adjustment, and recognize that there will be some unpredictable situations that take place. But overall, this simply helps us to help the students to meet their educational needs and goals. And that is the essence of what it means to be a teacher. So we need to always keep that in mind.